so I'd like to thank Beit Zitoun. I will be chairing the meeting. What will occur is we're going to get a 20-minute presentation from Stefan Kipfer. And then we're going to have a few people from different groups giving 5-minute presentations. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Have we got the electronic gadgetry working? And Stefan, take it away.
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me and for coming. All right, so I'm going to be a bit provocative and essentially suggest that there is no such thing as formation, at least not the way in which the press has been talking about it. There is, of course, a reality of Fordist populism, which is dangerous and real, but also full of contradictions. If I have some time, I'll make a few suggestions about what this may mean for the future, but we'll see if I have time. So now, all of you have been immersed, I'm sure, following more or less what's happening at City Hall. And if you have, likelihood is that you've become accustomed to thinking about this so-called Fortination in the two main ways it's been presented to us over the last couple of years. The first way that we've been taught to think about it is by thinking of Fortination as a suburban phenomenon. And the map that you've probably seen that was going to be here is a very simple map that divides the wards that have voted for Ford as a majority or a plurality, and those wards that have voted for Smitherman either as a majority or as a plurality. You have a simply divided map with Smitherman wards downtown. And you can imagine, right, the city of Toronto, almost everything surrounding the old city of Toronto and a bit more being blue or red, and the opposite color being for the middle. That's sort of what we've been seeing. And the other model is closely related, and it doesn't quite, it's not that easy to visualize it, but you can see it if you sort of squint a bit. Don't look at the details too much, but if you squint a bit, you see that the voting map for Ford, which is at the top, showing the blue ridings that he won. If you compare that map to the map by Professor Haljansky from U of T, which has been trying to map the city into 3 parts, including the red city, which has suffered mostly from a declining average income level. The red parts of the map, if you look at the two of them together, you see why some people have argued that Ford Nation is not only suburban, but it is an expression of the angry, non-white immigrant working class. And I quote directly, this is one of the main journalists has been saying this. Right? So this is the way we've been taught to think about Ford Nation: suburban, non-white, immigrant, working class, in some combination or the other. Now, we do have to, in my opinion, pause a bit to think a bit about the pitfalls of polling and maps. Not that these maps lie, not that they have nothing to do with reality. But there is a series of technical and methodological problems with this way of projecting from certain limited data onto a map that we have in our heads. Now, first set of pitfalls are technical. Right? You can see here, this is essentially the same map than the first map that maps the voting support for Ford in 2010. But in contrast to the typical map, which is simply a red or blue or whatever, this one goes beneath the ward level and shows variations in support. And so you can see what's wrong with the aggregate mapping exercise. It does not tell you anything about the variations in support. It glosses over the fact that there's all sorts of ridings between downtown and central Etobicoke and northern Scarborough, where the distinction in the support for Ford is between 10 and 20%. Right? It's a gradual difference, not an absolute difference. The other thing that even this map doesn't tell you, of course, is that there's also support for Ford downtown in all sorts of places. Not even this map tells you anything about that. And the other thing the other technical objection to this mapping exercise is simply that it doesn't tell you who did not respond to the call for the election, right? Yes, as you know, the voter participation increased from 2003 and 6 to 2010, but only half the population voted, right? Which means that the vast majority of people in Toronto did not cast a ballot for Ford. So these maps don't tell you anything about that. Here is a map of where voter abstention was higher than the average. So the green, the dark green, and the light green colors show you where fewer people participated. And as you can see, it so happens that a greater proportion of post-war suburbs of Toronto voted in smaller numbers than people in the central city, but also people in, for example, central Etobicoke. Right? So this map shows you that the very suburban aspect of support for Ford is also concentrated in areas where people actually voted less. Right? Now, I can give you one more, even better map. All these maps, by the way, are also all from Zach Taylor at U of T. Very nice maps. You can find them on the internet. I can give you the references if you want. These maps here try to compare certain aspects of the social geography of Toronto with the geography of voter abstention. Right? So you can see that on the left here is the same map, below average turnout for the election. On the left are three other categories. First one, the areas of the city where most people are first-generation immigrants. At the top, the areas of the city where you have a high concentration of non-white populations, visible minority populations. And finally, a map that shows the highest concentrations of below average income, right? So you can see that if you look at who participates in votes, fewer people who are poor, non-white, and first-generation immigrant vote. So here too, you see that the very constituencies that we are set to believe voted above all for Ford actually voted less in general in the election, right? So none of these realities you can get from the aggregate maps that simply compare majority or plurality votes for Ford or for Smithers. Now, I should say, by the way, all of this stuff I put together with my colleague Parastu Saveri, who was supposed to be here with me but had a conflict. So, but the work that we did here is a collective one. So, let me put this to a polemical point. What I'm trying to say here is what Pierre Bourdieu said in the early 70s, which is that public opinion does not exist. Public opinion as measured by polls or by electoral results or other kinds of opinion polling. What did he mean when he wrote this 2 generations ago? He simply suggested that polls, being opinion polls or voting results, do not express the will of the people, but instead are political instruments to rally people who responded to polls, the atomized population, to already formed opinions, to those already formed opinions that shape politics, that shape the relations of force in society. Let me go one step further and say that maps, which you didn't talk about, are equally problematic because they help us imagine geography. They help us imagine what goes in a city by abstracting from the very concrete realities that people face in specific situations. Maps are very good at glossing over those specific situations that people find themselves in. As a conclusion, I would like to submit to you that the fourth nation does not exist. If you think that the fourth nation is a pre-existing entity, an entity that exists autonomously from the journalists, the academics, the opinion makers, the parties, and the politicians that use polls, maps, and other such instruments in political dialogue. Fourth nation as an independent entity does not exist. Now, what does exist, of course, is the reality, the political reality of Fordism as, I wouldn't call it a movement, but as a political reality. And as such, of course, Fordism is indeed a very dangerous reality that we would be very much wrong to underestimate. I still think that the best way to analyze Fordism is by using that concept from Stuart Hall called authoritarian populism. This is a term that he used to describe Margaret Thatcher already in the late 1970s, and it's a concept that builds upon a whole series of illustrious predecessors, including Karl Marx and Antonio Gramsci, and that has since also been debated by various people, including by one of my colleagues, Gillian Hart, from Berkeley. Now, what is it about this authoritarian populism? It's a particular form of rule, form of bourgeois rule, in particular contexts. Context of crisis, context of stalemate, context where regular kinds of ways of ruling and governing are more difficult. And when, of course, when you think back to 2010, when Ford was elected, we were in the middle of a sort of a semi-crisis in Toronto. Right? We were in the middle of the aggressive push towards austerity in Canada and in Ontario. We were in a situation right after the G20, which left, I'm sure, a big impression on a lot of people, including politicians. And it's in that context that the Board of Trade of Toronto decided to make a concerted push to delegitimize Miller and his policies, which were not fundamentally different on all fronts than what Ford has been doing. But nonetheless, there was a concerted push by various forces in Toronto to present the Miller era the Miller regime as a spent force. It does not mean that Ford was the preferred candidate, of course, of the Board of Trade and others, but he happened to be best at presenting himself as a real force of change in that context where most dominant forces wanted a significant, at least symbolic change in 2010. Why was he in a better position to exploit this desire of change that came also from various ruling class circles? Paradoxically, precisely because he had fewer organic connections to many important power brokers in the city of Toronto. Right? Of course, he himself is connected to elements of the Canadian ruling class. He himself is a capitalist. You all know the story. But culturally, stylistically, and politically, he was not as well connected to Bay Street and some of the typical municipal brokers in Toronto as others, including Smitherman at the time. So that relative distance to the centers of ruling circles in Toronto actually was an advantage to him in presenting himself as a force of change. What also helps there, of course, is his attempt to establish himself as an anti-establishment candidate, realities notwithstanding, an important claim that is based partly on something that most of these populist figures have in common, which is they all dream of ruling personally. And in the Ford case, certainly we'd have to talk about not just Ford the mayor, but also Ford the brother, put the two of them together, you certainly do see certain parallels between them and other kinds of megalomaniac characters that have existed in other places and that have pursued similar kinds of policies. Dreams of personal rule often come along with claims to a direct form of legitimacy. This idea that the populist, the megalomaniac, has a direct line to the people, right? And of course, this is in this case not just an empty claim on Ford's side, but it's partly a result of the capacity of his campaign team to systematize what municipal politicians always do, which is to return calls when something is wrong with their property or something, when a pothole needs filling. You all know that municipal politicians spend 80-90% of their time doing that kind of stuff. Ford is no different, but his team has managed to systematize this way of linking to the people through this phone banking kind of system, right? And through the fact that Ford does indeed spend a greater amount of time doing some of this work directly, as opposed to having other people doing it for him. So that's one of course, source that behind this sort of claim to representing the people directly without the detour of city council, without the detour of the media, without the detour of the establishment, in quotation marks. Of course, ironically, the other way in which Ford has been trying to do so is through the media itself, right? Through his phone-in show that was another source of establishing another such direct line to the people. Populists, and I think Ford is one of those, the good ones at least, do actually develop a sensitivity to some of the elements of popular consciousness, contradictory as it may be. And so even though Ford isn't based on a Ford nation that exists as a political force independently of him, Ford and his campaign teams certainly have managed to speak to a whole variety of very contradictory kinds of sensibilities among all sorts of different people, including working class people, including people of color, including also a lot of elites and middle class people, of course. Right? And it's that capacity to speak to various elements in different people's self-conception, in different people's interests, that has partly, I think, been responsible for Ford's success. And I think we all know of a whole series of people that we personally know that may have connected to one or the other element of Ford's rule, be that his anti-tax stance, be that his personal style, be that his way of speaking, be that some other aspect of his politics. The last thing here is simply to sort of give you the other side of the coin. Of course, what the populists and Ford are very good at is then using those elements in popular consciousness and turning them upside down. Building up images of the public enemy, or the enemy of the people, that are often the people themselves. Right? So that the elites become the people themselves. So that the elites, the establishment, is characterized by some elements of the establishment, but really by the very people that he claims to represent. The city workers, the Tamil refugees, the cyclists, the homosexuals, and you get the point. Right? There's a real sense in which populists use elements of popular consciousness and turning it against the people themselves. So Ford is an important force as an example of authoritarian populism. Where are we at with Fordism now? One thing that Ford has not managed to do is to consolidate the populist regime. Right? Since the fall of 2000. 12 in particular, but starting before that already, his rule was riddled with a growing set of contradictions, which of course ended at the end with City Council decision to divest him of some of his powers. So there is no populist regime at the moment at City Hall. However, the 40 years certainly have deepened the neoliberal revolution in Canada. The neoliberal revolution which is much deeper than populism, which goes back to the 1980s, and which is carried, of course, by many people other than Ford and Harris and Harper, but also by various more progressively looking, in quotation marks, representatives of neoliberal politics. And there's no doubt that even if Ford should go down in the election campaign, which is by no means a certain matter, that he will overshadow the election campaign and probably will have an effect on the next term in some way or the other. There's no doubt. If we can follow the first signs of the election campaign in January. Let me just finish with one thing, and that is that one of the reasons why Barastu and I were developing this analysis around the maps and this critique of Ford Nation as an existing entity, we were trying to level also a critique of the critics of Ford, some of whom we think have actually helped normalize a whole series of very problematic tendencies in the city of Toronto. To the extent that you have influential voices in various parts of the intellectual establishment in the central city who say that Ford represents the angry non-white immigrant worker, they have themselves contributed to exactly what Ford is also doing, which is to stigmatize particularly the non-white working class districts in the post-war suburbs of Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough, that are the target already of state policy. The City of Toronto is already targeting policing, social policy, public housing redevelopment, and a bunch of other policies on those stigmatized neighborhoods. Today we have Ford and some of his critics converging on this sort of very racist way of stigmatizing a very important segment of the Toronto working class today. And that, of course, will likely be one of the legacies of his regime, even if he should go down. We finish with two points. One of the things, of course, I was not saying is that defeating Ford is not important. I think whatever we can all do to defeat him in one way or the other is going to be crucial. However, the perennial question in Toronto poses itself again. It's not a new question, but I think it poses itself even more urgently than it did in the past. Is it going to be possible, and how, to develop an alternative, not only to Ford and his kind of politics, but also to the more progressive and less obviously authoritarian representatives of neoliberal politics in the city, i.e. a coalition ranging from the NDP to, of course, the big L liberal power brokers in the city of Toronto. How will it be possible for us to build such an alternative? I don't know. Maybe we can discuss this later on.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan.